Life is unpredictable. Sports also are unpredictable, but fighting in particular is very unpredictable. Some would argue the most unpredictable sport there is. Anything can happen in the ring or cage, and sometimes fights produce polarizing results. Let's go over a few of the most polarizing wins in MMA history. Number 1. Matt Serra vs. George St. Pierre. Everyone loves an underdog story, right? Starting off the list, let's discuss what some people consider to be the biggest upset in MMA history. The first fight between Matt Serra and George St. Pierre. The two faced off at UFC 69. At the time, St. Pierre was the welterweight champion and had proven himself as a legend in the octagon. Out of his 13 fights, he had only lost a single bout. His challenger, meanwhile, was older, smaller, and less experienced than St. Pierre. Everyone thought St. Pierre would mop the floor with Serra. As the match began at UFC 69, the announcers began asking who would be St. Pierre's next challenger before the match even began. According to the scorecard, St. Pierre was the huge favorite. St. Pierre was the minus 1300 favorite, while Serra was the underdog at plus 850. However, Serra had a game plan. He knew he couldn't outstrike St. Pierre, so his plan was to get St. Pierre into a clinch and go to the ground from there. As the fight began, Serra immediately put St. Pierre on the defensive. Just like Tyson's infamous peekaboo, Serra used his smaller size to get on the inside. At the 3rd minute mark of the first round, the end began. Serra managed to land a right hook on St. Pierre's head, right behind his ear. From this strike, the champ was thrown off balance and dazed. Serra took advantage of this and immediately pounced on St. Pierre. From here, the challenger viciously unloaded on St. Pierre's head. The ref stepped in and gave the win to Serra via TKO. Following this fight, St. Pierre and Serra would eventually fight again, which St. Pierre would win. To this day, UFC 69 remains among the biggest upsets in MMA history. Number 2. Luke Rockhold vs. Michael Bisping 2.
He hit the ball of the foot into the ribcage.
The fight between GSP and Matt Serra is a prime example of an underdog story, but it's far from the only time an underdog won. Another great example was the second fight between Luke Rockhold and Michael Bisping at UFC 199. This was the second fight between the Count and Rockhold. Their first fight was at UFC 55. Going into UFC 55, Bisping was the underdog. Rockhold, meanwhile, was held at minus 500 betting odds. Not as drastic as the bout between GSP and Serra, but comparable. After Rockhold made Bisping tap out less than a minute into the first round, Rockhold would then go on to secure the UFC middleweight championship. Not only was there a score to settle, but there was a title. Bisping had all the motivation in the world to beat Rockhold. As the fight began, Bisping immediately began applying pressure to Rockhold. The Count continued to throw punches at the champ, while Rockhold tried keeping his opponent away with kicks. Slowly, the exchanges between Bisping and Rockhold became more and more heated. As the first round was nearing its end, Bisping threw an overhand shot that hit Rockhold on the jaw. The champ fell, and the Count immediately took advantage of the situation. Bisping rushed the challenger and began unloading on him on the ground. Rockhold, however, wasn't ready to quit just yet. The champ managed to get back up onto his feet, only to be hit with the same shot from Bisping. Once again, the champ fell onto the canvas with his back against the cage. Bisping began throwing hook after hook at Rockhold's head before the ref stepped in and gave the win to Bisping. This loss ended Rockhold's 5-win streak and led him to losing his next several fights. Number 3. Anderson Silva vs. Chris Weidman.
Very careful with this game he's playing here.
Anderson. Oh, he got hit!
The fight between Rockhold and Bisping was certainly a polarizing match. But you know what makes a fight even more upsetting? When a legend loses to an up-and-comer. When Anderson Silva, the legendary Spider, lost to Weidman at UFC 162, fight fans were shocked. Anderson Silva was the middleweight champion at the fight. He had over 30 fights and lost a mere 4. Silva wasn't just a dominant and deadly striker, but he was also an incredible grappler. Silva used his strikes offensively and his grappling defensively, making him a deadly fighter. Weidman, meanwhile, was a mere up-and-comer. This was his 10th fight, although he was undefeated for his past 9 fights. There was some weight to his name, considering he had successfully beaten 9 other fighters others, but Weidman certainly had his work cut out for him. Everyone thought Silva would, once again, showcase his dominance and retain his well-earned title. The fight was a war from the beginning. Less than 30 seconds into the first round, Weidman successfully shot out at Silva and managed to secure a takedown. He tried to ground and pound the champ, but Silva was able to secure an armbar and defend himself. It was evident the champ was a bit shook. He seemed less aggressive and a lot more defensive. As the first round was nearing its end though, Silva regained its confidence. He dropped his guard multiple times and openly invited Weidman to score some headshots. Although Silva's head movement is one of his biggest strengths, it wasn't enough. Weidman landed multiple headshots, leading Silva to continue rethinking his confidence. As the second round began, this pattern continued. Silva kept his guard down, overly confident in his head movement, and openly challenged Weidman to score headshots. And once again, Weidman rose to the occasion. This couldn't continue. Weidman rushed at Silva and began throwing shots. Silva, expectedly, began moving his head and leaned back. Weidman landed a cross that hit Silva's chin, dropping the champ. Weidman immediately got on top of Silva and began unloading on the Spider. Within a few shots, the ref ran over and gave Weidman the win. Undoubtedly, Silva is a legend, but he drastically underestimated Weidman. Fighting is unpredictable, even for champions. Anything can happen. Number 4. Conor McGregor vs. Nate Diaz 1.
He hurt him with that left. Look out! Look out for the takedown. The guillotine! He is all over!
Ego is the enemy. Silva learned that the hard way at UFC 162. But there's someone who was humbled much harder than Silva, Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor is known for a lot of things. His intense trash talk, however, is definitely one of his highlights. Going into his first fight with Nate Diaz at UFC 196, McGregor was vicious against Diaz. Both fighters were explosive out of the gate. They were both incredibly proactive, throwing shot after shot at one another. As the strikes continued, Diaz began taking headshot after headshot. Notorious was notorious in his strikes. Diaz actually had his left eyebrow cut open, leading to blood ceaselessly pouring out. Diaz, however, was far from out. He kept soldiering on against the Irishman. As the second round began, the striking continued, as did Diaz's bleeding. His face was half red, half white as the round continued. McGregor was wearing it like a badge of honor, across his chest and arms. Yet Diaz kept pressing. He wasn't gonna go down easy to Notorious. Eventually, the end came. After a striking war, McGregor decided to change things up and went for a takedown on Diaz. McGregor took out his legs and went to the ground. Diaz, however, quickly managed to get on top of his opponent. From there, the two began to unload on one another. Eventually, McGregor got turned onto his back and Diaz was on top. This spelled the end of Notorious and broke his aura of invincibility. Nate Diaz put McGregor in a vicious rear naked choke. Although he was bleeding and battered, he clenched McGregor's neck like an anaconda constricting its prey. Nearly immediately after being put in the chokehold, McGregor tapped. After the ref managed to pry Diaz off of McGregor, we got one of the coldest moments in UFC history. Nate Diaz hit a front double bicep pose and began walking towards the camera. Even after winning, his bleeding continued. His face was essentially a tomato. After taking out his mouth guard, Diaz shouted at the camera, "No matter how good of a fighter you are, fights are unpredictable. Anything can happen. Always stay on guard."